Hello, David McKinster here once again, and today I'm giving some brief remarks regarding the philosophy of Simone de Beauvoir. I consider her to be a figure worth examining in her own right, although very often she's simply, I think, disrespectfully, people lead with, "Oh, well, she was Jean-Paul Sartre's girlfriend." Yeah, well, so who was in fact the mentor to whom? I think they would have said and did say on a number of occasions that they were both equally uh, responsible for the advances in existentialism that the two of them are known for. And de Beauvoir went her own way on a number of issues, as did Sartre. And also, I hope you're enjoying the book, The Ethics of Ambiguity, as much as I did, because it is a marvelously written book. Her writing is much more clear, elegant, and flows better than quite a few books in this area. Um, well, she was a brilliant student. Set milestones for her academic achievements. The first woman to do this, the first woman to do that. In the grueling university examinations, she finished second, which was again unprecedented for a woman. And guess who finished first? Jean-Paul Sartre. She had a long time uh, relationship with Sartre. Okay, um, they experimented in polyandrous relationships. They tried to live the unconventional and exploratory philosophy that they both espoused. Um, but enough about Sartre. And this is Simone de Beauvoir, author of The Second Sex. Okay, Second Sex is essentially a classic of feminist theory and a fine contribution to existentialism. Now, we're reading the Ethics of Ambiguity because I think it more broadly establishes the principles that are applied to the second sex, and it's more likely that you'll read the second sex in conjunction with some other course. So I decided to go with the Ethics of Ambiguity, and I'm very happy with with that choice. I hope you are as well. Although, if you're interested, I would certainly recommend that you read the Second Sex. Um, okay, de Beauvoir uh, essentially tells us that there is a paradox at the core of existentialism, and that is because there is a paradox at the core of being human. You are subject to yourself. That is, in fact, the source of freedom, choice, and transcendence. And I will talk more about transcendence later, so just put that term on back burner. You are subject to yourself. Your subjectivity is a fundamental fact of your life. But you are object to others. You share a world with others, and to them you are object. They do not experience your subjectivity. You may influence what they experience in their subjectivity and vice versa. But in being object, there is fasticity. That is, that is, you are situated, there is a sort of a concreteness. Okay? This tension is the human condition. Okay? Fasticity, I like to compare to Sartre's notion of being in itself, as opposed to being for itself. In being in itself, in fasticity, there is a limit. Okay, I am this, not that. But it is also a precondition for freedom. How? Well, we bring our values into play in order to make choices, and our choices are not random or arbitrary because they are the expression of our values and our experience of life. Nietzsche once said, you know, someone said that he did not approve of Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche said, "How could you? You haven't lived my life." And that's a bit of an extreme way to put it, but You get what he means, right? Yes. This is an expression of how my subjectivity, how my values have come into play in making my choices. The choices aren't simply random, but they're not determined in any sense of hard determinism. They could have been otherwise. In fact, our freedom consists of the fact that we can, in any situation, no matter how many factors are involved in putting us into the situation we're in, we can still choose to do something else. In fact, there are many wonderful dramas, particularly coming out of the World War II era, which are exactly about that. If you ever get a chance to see a production of the play Incident at Vichy, it's a wonderful play, and a number of people have been rounded up by the Nazis in occupied France, and they're about to be one by one interrogated, and those who don't pass the interrogation, if you will, are going to be shipped off, presumably to be imprisoned and killed. One of the people picked up was an aristocrat, an educated man, a civilized man. He, the sort of man who finds it very difficult to believe that the same nation that produced Schiller and Beethoven is doing this stuff now, these atrocities. In the end, he makes, out of the blue, a choice that changes everything for himself and for at least one other prisoner. And I'm not going to tell you what that choice is, because that would be a huge spoiler if you ever do get a chance to see it. I believe the entire play, the entire production is on YouTube if you ever want to see that. Our choices are not determined, but they're not arbitrary. That's important. Arbitrary means there's no reason for it. Right? Random means it's just basically it's happening because of forces outside of our own choices. That's not the case at all. We have the ability to choose. In fact, in his essay, Existentialism and Human Emotions, Jean-Paul Sartre characterizes one of the core realities of human existence is that we are condemned to freedom. Why condemned? Well, because we can't get away from it. We're free. As Albert Camus put it, we'll be looking more at Sartre later and then more at Camus as well. As Albert Camus put it, if you choose not to choose, you are choosing for the status quo. Even not choosing is itself a choice. Okay? So, no way are our choices simply arbitrary or random. We have values. Well, I like to, if you've ever taken a course from me before, and as you may have guessed by things I've said this time around, I am a big enthusiast of the films of Akira Kurosawa, the Japanese filmmaker. I want to quote something from a book on Kurosawa. The Warrior's Camera, okay, films of Akira Kurosawa by Stephen Prince. Prince commented about one of Kurosawa's films, Stray Dogs, which is a film noir, if you will. It was released the year before his classic Rashomon. Okay, now I have spoken in other classes extensively about Rashomon, so I won't bother to do that here. But let's just say it is, in the end, if you understand the existential perspective of Kurosawa, the ending of Rashomon, which befuddles many people, makes perfect sense. One of the characters simply makes that sort of, I have to choose who I am. I have to choose who I'm going to be. I'm going to make this choice that no one would have anticipated that I would have made, but I'm going to make it. I am free, no matter how degraded my circumstances are. I am free to make a better choice. Okay? Prince observed on the issue of good versus evil that issue of good versus evil dissolves into a matter of existential choice for Kurosawa. No use endlessly debating whether people are born bad or become bad through circumstances. The real issue is, who will we choose to be? Benefactors or just stray dogs? Okay? You keep that in mind. This is an exaltation of the human freedom, not simply to give up and say, I'm a victim of circumstance. No, if you say you're a victim of circumstance, your surrender to circumstance becomes a part of that circumstance, and you're choosing that. You're choosing surrender. Okay, now, as I said a moment ago, transcendence. Okay, transcendence is it is basically our ability to rupture the given. That is what convention, what those expectations imposed from without amount to, just to rupture that given through choice. I can do what is not expected of me. And in doing what is not expected of me, I may in fact be realizing my freedom in a much more positive, or even some would say heroic way. Okay, here's an example of this from The Second Sex. De Beauvoir is often quoted as saying, "One is not born, but becomes a woman." Now, recent times, we hear a lot more about that debate. Your biology isn't what makes you a woman in the sense of what society means by a woman. I put all sorts of expectations on you because of your biological gender. Those expectations have nothing to do with your chromosomes, have nothing to do with your anatomy. Those expectations have to do with how I have conceived of you. And I'm now, I would be addressing, when I think I'm addressing you, I'd be addressing you as objectifying, because I'm not really seeing you. I'm seeing my expectations projected on you. Okay. When we talk about phenomenology, I'm going to talk about Baudelaire, and we'll talk a great deal more about that. Okay, oppression is denying the ambiguity of existence, that subject-object tension, and thus denying the freedom of others. Bad faith, a very important term for existentialist thinkers, bad faith simply is not acknowledging the freedom that we have. Your own freedom and the freedom of others. Others have that same freedom. They can be who they choose to be. If I see you, and because of your race, because of your gender, because of your economic class, because of your religion, because of whatever, I have expectations which turn you into an object for me and deny your ability to choose, your ability to actualize your freedom. That is what oppression is. De Beauvoir also talks about mystification. Mystification means that you're being oppressed, but you embrace it. The oppressor projects onto you an identity that you embrace. Why? Either you don't realize you're free, or it's easier, you're frightened, you're bribed, you're offered rewards for just meeting other people's expectations, and threatened with punishment if you don't. Seems to me that gets worked into the fabric of the way religion is practiced. Okay. Although I would not for one moment say that it is a necessary and defining part of religious consciousness. Nevertheless, look at how religion is practiced in not every religion, but and not every instance, every practitioner of every religion, but look at how ubiquitous that is, reward and punishment. You be who I expect you to be, and I'll reward you for it. You don't be what I expect you to be, and I will punish you for not meeting my expectations. I worked in the corporate world for, yeah, here it comes, for maybe 20 years, largely in the software industry. One of my colleagues once said, he was known for the practice of what people call sucking up. That is, in other words, you indulge in flattery and just try to really appeal to those who have control over who gets a raise, who gets a promotion, and so forth. You try to appeal to those people by, as much as possible, being who they would prefer you to be. And who do they prefer you be? They prefer that you be just like them. And it even goes to hiring practices. I don't know how much experience you have in the corporate world, but that's the bane of hiring. Is I want to hire people who remind me of myself, rather than people who have the proper work ethic, the proper work values, the record of teamwork, the record of accomplishment. Well, yeah, but you're going to play handball with me during lunch? That's more important. You're going to come to the parties I throw? Do you play golf? Now, of course, there's my son plays golf. There's nothing intrinsically evil about golf. It's just, but it's part of an entire persona that you're asking people to assume, and you'll reward them for assuming it, and you'll punish them if they don't, or at least withhold rewards if they don't play up to your expectation. But if you embrace that wholeheartedly, if you don't even realize this is a form of oppression, that you are being robbed of your freedom, you are being robbed of who you are, that is mystification. That is embracing the objectification of others. It's an identity projected by the oppressor, and you are buying right into it because, as I say, you either don't know, you're either being bribed or threatened into accepting it, or whatever. Rebellion, if you will, is what makes you free. The ability to say no, or to decide whether to say no or yes, is what makes you free. And what makes you free is what makes you human. So, now consider racism. Frantz Fanon, a wonderful thinker who was very much endorsed, a psychiatrist who worked with the psychology of the oppressed in Africa. He was himself an African, and Jean-Paul Sartre promoted his work a great deal. And he said, and Sartre repeated, racism is bad faith. When we give it in these terms, you're objectifying, you are denying, if you will, the ability of a person to transcend circumstance simply, or even trying to prevent them from doing so, simply because of, and that's just because of the color of their skin. I mean, that's the trigger, but the whole deal is that you have projected an identity upon them, which is not necessarily them, but that's all you're going to see. We could talk about confirmation bias and that sort of thing, but I mean, you get the picture, right? Racism, sexism, classism, ableism, those are all instances of projecting an identity upon people in a way that denies their freedom, that denies this basic existential ambiguity. Okay? Blaise Pascal, mathematician and philosopher, religious thinker, Pascal once said, "You cannot free fools from the chains they adore." Well, think of it. Take a look at the political scene and ask me again if why anyone would think such a thing. Well, it's endemic to politics, not only in our own country but all around the world. People end up adoring chains that are oppressing them. My son is a historian, and by education he's a historian, and he once said to me, one thing that keeps me from ever considering being a Marxist is I think there's a basic false premise without which Marxism has no power. What is that false premise? The false premise is that given all the pertinent information and given freedom of choice, people are going to consistently choose what's in their own best interest. They are not going to reject things that are clearly in their own best interest. Of course they will. That's just not the way it works. It's not the way history has worked. It's not the way politics works. If I shoot myself in the foot because I'm angry at some other group that's been identified as the other and the root of all my problems, then am I going to say, oh, maybe I shouldn't have shot myself in the foot? No, I'm going to blame my typical scapegoats. Okay. You see, there's a whole lot to be unfolded from these ideas. Oppression, says de Beauvoir, is self-contradictory. Why? Because oppression requires a free subject. I can't oppress someone who is not otherwise free. Here is my cup of coffee. I cannot oppress my cup of coffee. Why? Because it has no freedom. It is a thing in itself, not a thing for itself, not aware and conscious of its own being and able to choose. Right glad I am about that. A friend of mine says, she likes to say, I don't know, people say they don't believe in witchcraft, and yet every morning I brew up this jet black brew that magically brings me to life. I appreciate that witticism because I do the same. Okay, oppression requires a free subject, and yet it denies the subjectivity of the oppressed. Overcoming oppression requires, de Beauvoir says, and this is really interesting to me, I hope it is to you as well, requires that we at least temporarily suspend our good faith about the oppressor. The oppressor is, we objectify the oppressor. Why? Because we have to use force, temporarily at least, to stop the oppressor from oppressing us. Okay? Violence, she says, is a last resort, but it may be a resort. Okay? Heidegger, again, who we'll talk about later in this course, Martin Heidegger talked about tolerance, and he said there is a paradox about tolerance. Say you want to tolerate free discussion, any political ideas you should be allowed to discuss, and to act upon those ideas. That's your freedom. You can do that. He said, but there's a problem. What if the person's ideology and the actions based on that ideology are meant to deny you your freedom? What do? Well, if you want freedom to exist at all, you're going to have to stop that person at some point. Okay? Now, I always think of that when people talk about so-called cancel culture, which I think in many instances, I mean, it can be carried too far, but as can any idea. But in many instances, it's just a matter of saying, you know what? If you're going to behave like that, you're going to be held accountable. Oh, no, you can't. You're violating my freedom of speech if you criticize me, and if you hold me accountable, and if you refuse to essentially subsidize what I'm saying by patronizing me. Well, no, that's just it's recognizing that there are consequences for how you exercise your freedom. Okay? Violence and existentialism, we'll return to that every now and then. Interestingly, during the 1970s, a British psychiatrist, who was at the time considered a significant existentialist thinker, his name was R.D. Laing, existential psychiatry, an interesting idea. But Laing wrote a book about Jean-Paul Sartre's thought called Reason and Violence. Sartre wrote an introduction for it, something that he didn't usually endorse other people's interpretations of his thought. But he said Laing's got it right. Laing has actually understood what I meant and has expressed it accurately. Now, I did not get around to reading the book, but several of my professors did, and they all said the same thing, which was also what the press was saying at the time, which was he may very well have Sartre, pardon me, Sartre right, but the problem is he's no easier to understand than the original. Sartre, the things he's interpreting from Sartre are hard to understand, but Lang, if he's represented them accurately, has not managed to clarify them. Well, why write about ideas if you don't clarify those ideas? Well, something also I think that is mentioned by de Beauvoir and by Sartre and those influenced by them is that in any culture there are going to be people who enjoy certain privileges, unearned and probably inappropriate privileges. Inappropriate because those privileges deny others their freedom. Those privileges are bad faith. But if you are in the habit of expecting privilege, then the attempt to equalize things, to remove privilege and make it a level playing field, may feel like oppression to the privileged. They don't see themselves as oppressors. They see themselves as entitled. And this, if you try to make it an even playing field again, this is not simply, they don't see that as, okay, it's proper that we respect the freedom of everyone, that we equalize this. But instead of that, they might say, well, look, you're taking away my freedom. You see this as sort of a unintentional irony again and again. For the past half century, we've seen that regarding race. You're going to tell me I cannot oppress black people? That's tyranny. I can bloody well oppress anyone I want. I've often pointed out, and I've had any number of people who are devout practicing Christians agree with me about this, that Christianity in this country is better protected, more privileged, more wealthy, whatever, than it has been probably in any other time in history. And yet, if you tell people they can't have special privilege, Christianity cannot have special privileges, and I'm not picking on Christianity, I'm just because that's the majority religion of those who are religious in our culture. If you say, well, you can't use public funds to promote your religion, that's in the Constitution, right? Let's say, oh, you're oppressing me. Okay, I actually knew someone once who said, well, Christians are oppressed in this country. I went to apply for a job at a 7-Eleven, and they asked me, can you work on Sundays? And I said, no, I can't, because my religion doesn't allow me to work on Sundays. And they said, I'm sorry, we can't hire you. We need someone to cover the Sunday shifts. So you see, she said, Christians are persecuted. What? No, you weren't available when they needed you. Okay? Supposing you had been a Seventh-day Adventist and they had needed to cover the Saturday shift. No, that's not oppression. That's actually is treating everyone equally. But if you are in because of race, religion, economic class, education, whatever, if you are in the habit of being treated as privilege, you don't see it as privilege. It becomes invisible to you. Okay? And then if you oppose the removal of privilege, and you claim that removing your privilege is some sort of oppression, you're oppressing me by not allowing me to oppress others, that is bad faith. So, important idea, willing oneself free. The authentic ethic is realizing freedom for oneself, which requires that you recognize the freedom of others. Okay? Purpose of ethics is not codes. but rather to realize as fully as possible your freedom and the freedom of others. Ludwig Wittgenstein is one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, not an existentialist, considered an analytical philosopher. His two favorite philosophers, he said on a number of occasions, his two favorite philosophers were Soren Kierkegaard and Saint Augustine. And this is like, this is the golden idol of linguistic philosophy. Don't take that so seriously as to be offended if you have a preference for analytical philosophy. But Wittgenstein once said, and he was surrounded by people like G.E. Moore, for instance, one of the people who were very, very important in the formation of philosophical ethics in the 20th century. He said once, if anybody ever wrote a book on ethics that was really about ethics, it would blow away all the other books on ethics that people are writing. Well, he never elaborated, as far as I know, what such a book would be. But I tend to feel, especially given his admiration of Kierkegaard and St. Augustine, that his thought was in some ways similar to this notion. You bring your subjectivity into your actions in the world, insofar as your values are worked into your choices, and your choices, as Jean-Paul Sartre said, our choices make us who we are. We are the sum total of our choices. Well, freedom for oneself, freedom for others, there is no way to justify that you are entitled to freedom unless you recognize that existential tension that would also entail the freedom of everyone else. So, okay, if you wanted to, some people would say, if you wanted to derive an imperative from de Beauvoir's ethical writings, it would be maybe involve these three things. One, eschew bad faith. Do not flee from your own freedom. Use freedom as the premise of action. Embrace the nothingness of freedom. That is the no-thingness. I mean, people explaining various schools of Buddhism to Westerners often use some very similar language. It is not a thing. It is not a determinate thing like the thing in itself. Embrace the no-thingness of freedom. Freedom is the space, if you will, in which your authentic choices are made. There's, in a sense, John Cage, a 20th century composer, composed a piece. It's called 3:30 something or other. It's just the length of time that it takes place. And what the pianist does is simply comes out, sits at the piano, and does nothing for a little over 3 minutes, and then gets up and leaves. Now, some people said this was total fraud. Look at how contemporary art is an abomination. No, it's actually Cage, who was himself a Zen Buddhist, said, what I want is for people to understand you never hear music with a quiet mind. I want them to become aware of the space in which they normally hear music. In other words, the ambient noise of the concert hall, that's the space in which you hear music. And is that important? Yeah. Well, the no-thingness, your own freedom, that's the space in which your authentic choices are made. And finally, part 3, the rejection of oppression, for all the reasons we've mentioned. Okay. Now, I hope you are enjoying Simone de Beauvoir's thought as much as I am, and her writing. I mean, granted, we're reading it in translation, but my goodness, This flows very nicely, does it not? Okay, now I put 3 study questions on the Moodle page, and you might look at those and keep those in mind as you are reading the Ethics of Ambiguity. But also, you will have a chance to. There is no writing assignment on those due immediately, but they will eventually be incorporated into a writing assignment. Okay, so you may want to take notes. Okay, good stuff, huh? Thank you.